Yes.
Because
Then
it's
still doing whatever.
technically time now, but yeah, we're not.
Yeah.
Well,
Do you want to go nudge Richard or are you? Yeah, fair enough. I've got this thing. But you ain't seen anything.
You can ferry people in.
I should go ahead.
Sorry.
Scream. Restart again.
Technically 11.
Mm. You've got to do it twice, isn't it, as well?
Yeah.
I've got another talk at half past.
Yeah, well,
I think, yeah.
our talk basically twice in a row this morning. And then I guess it will be yours.
Happy
Oh
now.
no, it's not you, is it? It's you.
Hey, Callum.
Junior.
Lovely to see you, mate.
Yeah, no way.
I got him into the shop though.
Yeah, we'll very get back at him. Might make a start.
Yeah. Got 9 on the old live. Has Rachel gone for like a nervous wee or something?
I don't think so. Went out and sort of checked in with Rick.
Oh, yeah.
Rick hasn't started yet either. So I think she just wanted to check in.
Running late.
Yeah.
Hi, Hannah.
So this one kind of just waiting for her to get back now and then that's it, we'll just start.
Hi, everyone. 26 people now. Half enough.
Hello. That's alright. Cool. I'm thinking
Yeah. You got a massive
He's
audience.
got live stream going already, waiting for us. Yeah.
Permanent. Yeah. Photographic evidence.
Right, yeah, we'll make a start now. So thank you for joining us all in the dungeon today. Yeah, we'll be doing a little talk on kind of prehistoric ants and kind of giving a little sort of summary of some of like the evolution of ant species and a little bit of like how we kind of figure out some of the stuff and some comparisons to like modern species. So to start off with, we're just gonna go through a little like glossary of some terms because we have a couple of scientific terms in here and they might not be ones you're familiar with, so we just want to go on top of speed. These down here just give you a quick reference. So this is a little visual of like a basic representation of the phylogenetic tree for the species, which kind of shows the order of evolution. And then this is kind of just a geological time scale. So kind of roughly like the early ancestors of like the wasps appeared like quite early on, back towards sort of like Cambrian times. But like our kind of ants started a lot later on, but we'll get into that in more detail later. So some of the terms we're using, so amber is one of the main things that we'll be talking about really, which is a prehistoric fossilized tree resin. So we have a couple of examples here that Rachel is going to go around and show you. So yeah, this is one of the main things that we kind of use to sort of study them, because that's where we find a lot of the fossils. Because insect bodies are quite delicate, they don't often fossilize in rock. So we're reliant on them essentially getting stuck in tree sap on a tree that is then managing to survive fossilized within rock for the millions of years until we find it in the modern day. The other form we've got is something called copal, which is basically a younger form of amber. So they're very similar and they look very similar, but mainly the age determines what classification it comes under. So eusocial is one of the things we're talking about, which is essentially the social organisation of the species. Formicidae is the Latin name for the family of ants. Polyreinae is a subfamily that Rachel will be giving you a little bit of information on later on. And Hymenoptera is essentially the overall group that includes ants, wasps, bees. And Mutilidae is one that we'll touch on a little bit, that is the group that includes species like velvet ants. So, yes, moving on. One of the things, basically, how we started planning this is we sort of used the general paleo method, which is kind of like, you essentially kind of like discuss the information we have and like read through some of the material we have, and then potentially while going through that you can form questions that you might feel are not answered. So these are some of the questions that we essentially came up with while going through our discussion. So this is one of the first ones, which was like, did ants originally express solitary behaviours more akin to species like velvet ants and solid wasps? And did social behaviours develop later to help improve survival during stressful situations? The second question that came up is like, do we have a good idea of the order of evolution between ants and other Hymenopteran species? So thinking along the lines of like, what came first? Was it velvet ants? Was it solitary ant species? And like, was the lack of workers a more original model? And then, did the development of social behaviours reduce the strength of venoms, or even the presence of venoms entirely, due to the development of chemical communication? So the next slide we'll go through will basically cover a lot of the information we have on these questions. So starting off with the first one, ants do potentially display eusocial behaviours on a small scale initially when they first evolved. Evidence does seem to indicate that like eusocial behaviours were not seen at all until the family of Formicidae first appeared.
Can I ask a question? What's eusocial?
So eusocial is basically the social organisation. So ants have a queen and a worker caste, essentially, for a very basic level. Yeah. And it's that sort of working together, cooperating with other members of the species is quite a unique trait of these insect species. And eusocial is just our fancy term for referring to that organisation.
He'll know this, not me.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Don't worry about it. So yeah, basically that evolved with the occurrence of our more ant-like species. But the thing with eusociality is it's not binary, so it's not just you have a social species or you don't. Some species will be like a mega colony and have thousands and millions of workers, but some you might only get a few where they're more represented as kind of groups of sisters that might fight over who gets to lay the eggs. So Rachel is going to go ahead and give you a couple of examples of that now.
Yeah. Often, Formicidae obviously have usually one queen, everyone behaves themselves, everyone works together. You get the pond-rain type, like your harps, your diacama. Some of them don't behave as they should, but sometimes they argue and have gamma gates, and rather than queens, they have a completely different social structure where they will hunt individually, and working as a team to take things is often not really on their agenda, is it? They work as a solitary. It's very primitive. The behaviour to work together tend to come after they arrive.
Yeah. So yeah, things like, especially like the harping map and venator, if you watch the way they hunt, obviously like one individual would go out and hunt an item of prey and then bring that item of prey back to the nest itself. But like if you watch the latest monitor colony, for example, one might go and find food and then go back and get the rest of its friends to come and help out in dispatching of that food and taking it in. So it's quite a different sort of organisation. So yes, moving on to our next slide, which kind of covers our next question. It is quite typical for animals to lose energy-intensive traits if not required. So with relation to our question about ants of like venoms disappearing as social behaviours occurred, obviously venom is quite a complex protein compound, and it takes a lot of energy to actually make a venom, especially a very strong, potent one. So if you're then trying to produce chemical communication techniques as well as venom, you're going to require a very intensive diet to be able to maintain that. So it is quite common to spot that actually a lot of the ant species will start to lose the strength of their venoms, and in some species it has disappeared entirely, because essentially it's on the logic of the more ants you have, you can kill prey quicker. Whereas if you're one of the species of ant that is hunting solitary, to kill that prey quickly, you're going to want a good offensive weapon against it, which is the venom they use. But if you've got more, they don't need that high potency venom, so they can reduce the strength of that venom. But this does kind of pose another question, because as we mentioned, do ants have venom, or do they just spray acid? Because a lot of modern day species that are quite social will actually just be acid sprayers rather than using venom. So Rachel's going to give a bit more information on this now.
I'll say the difference between your pond range and your social ants, you don't get or haven't yet found any of the pond range that have acid rather than stings, because they hunt solitary, they require that to take their prey. Most of the time, the social groups obviously they work as a team to overcome something with acid. Often it has been developed as a defence, but if we look at the way yellow craziers completely destroyed Christmas Island, they swarmed them crabs until they couldn't breathe. That was purely intentional. They were quite clever in it, got to give them the gin, but they used it as a weapon. So the defence can, again, be swung round in the evolution to be used as a weapon as well as a defence.
Yeah, so as we see, they do have quite complex development of behaviours throughout their history. So going on to the next question, basically, when we were starting to look at the pattern of evolution, we, as slightly mentioned earlier, we saw that the ant species did appear before the development of their eusocial behaviours. So yes, the evidence in the fossil record does seem to indicate that our more solitary species with fewer workers is the sort of more primitive base model that developed into ant species. Our ants evolved from wasp-like ancestors in the early Cretaceous period, about 140 to 180 million years ago. So they've been around for quite a long time. But actually, a lot of the social species that we know and look at today are actually sort of the more rare form within the Hymenoptera group. Because when we looked at the statistics, it's about 3/4 of species are actually still solitary, despite the fact that we commonly think of them as quite colonial species. So this slide again kind of gives you a bigger view of the phylogenetic tree that we talked about. So essentially you start up here, and this kind of shows your sort of first early species. So you can see here that we started off with some of our more kind of primitive style wasps. And actually the interesting when we looked at it is the early behaviours used by a lot of wasps are actually parasitic styles of behaviour. So basically parasitism occurred first, and then that eventually evolved into more of our regular form of wasp, but they were still the parasitic ones. And it wasn't until a lot later on that we actually started getting the ants, and kind of after that you get these weird hybrid almost looking forms, which are the velvet ants that we mentioned earlier. So yeah, it's quite interesting looking at the evolutionary pattern, but essentially we had ants appear, and then social behaviour started occurring instead of parasitism, and then the wasps also ended up developing social behaviours at the same, like, at a later period, but in the same kind of manner. So it's quite interesting seeing this sort of convergent evolution happening. Yeah, and it's always difficult to figure out, because with paleo, obviously, we're looking at ancient species. We're relying on what's actually managed to survive to the modern day. So a lot of it is kind of having to use common sense and logic to figure out as best as possible what we have. And as when we were showing the amber earlier, like, it's very difficult to analyse these insects. So with modern taxonomy, we'll look a lot at the actual, like, genitalia and features of the species through physical dissections. But you can't do that with a prehistoric ant species, because by the time you've got it out of the amber, the specimen is going to be destroyed. So one new technique that we're actually developing to look at these species is the use of CT scanning. It's not been done on any ant species yet, but at the Bonn University, there was a study they did on beetles that they'd really struggled to classify so far. But then this university, they decided to put them under CT scans, which allowed them to produce models that essentially we can do the same kind of dissection of on the model that allows us to analyse the features similar to modern insects. So hopefully, if we start using that technique with some of our prehistoric ant species, we'll be able to get a much better picture of the kind of pattern of their evolution. So yeah, that's essentially the bits that we had to cover. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Describe for a beginner why you distinguish between parasitic and social.
Yes, so obviously parasitic species tend to be more solitary hunters. So we know them having a kind of strong venoms that they can use to paralyze the prey item, so then they can lay their eggs inside of it. And then those eggs will raise, the larvae will eat the individual from the inside out typically, and then they will all scatter off individually and live on their own until they end up finding a mate, and then the cycle begins again. Whereas obviously our social species tend to have that more kind of cooperation, so you have the workers that will work together to take down an item of prey, rather than relying on like a strong venom. They're either going to use like a strong biting force, like some of the species we see like bull ants and things that have very large mandibles, or, you know, they're going to develop kind of like formic acid sprays, which is, acid is a lot simpler to produce than the complex compound that is a venom. So that's kind of the difference, is it kind of explains a lot why we see parasitism first, because it's a lot simpler model of survival.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Jurassic Park, like, is there any DNA in the amber, or like, are they ever going to be able to pull apart an amber sample and maybe stick the DNA in an egg or something? Like, no.
Because there is the potential for DNA, there is the potential for cell material to survive.
Yeah, but
so
nothing.
In some T-Rex fossils, we've actually opened them and we found the remains of like blood cells and things like that within them. But all of the DNA has already degraded due to the half-life being quite short for DNA. So DNA will break down a lot quicker than the actual soft cell material will in the right conditions.
So no Jurassic Park fans.
No, unfortunately not. Go ahead.
So you were talking about the CT scans and scanning the amber for the prehistoric ants.
Yeah.
If maybe, you said how if you broke open the amber, it would be destroyed. If the DNA was still, or any of it was still intact, surely, well, could you maybe put it into a modern ant that was closer to one of them and see more accurately what it was like?
Theoretically, if you could recover DNA, yes, you could then analyse the DNA and compare it to modern species to kind of help with classifying them, because there is a big study that's been done to do a lot of the classification so far that was looking at the DNA profiling of modern species, But the difficulty is, yes, is trying to find that DNA in the first place. But if we did find it, it would be an incredibly useful tool to understanding these species. So I mean, it kind of depends on the geology of the area.
All specimens about 112 million years old.
Yeah.
I believe that was one of the hell ants, wasn't it?
Yeah. Because the hell ants are like a weird kind of one where they sort of evolved like ants for a while, but then they evolved back towards the wasp-like form. So they kind of were in this weird one where they couldn't quite decide what they wanted to be,
Yeah. To
essentially.
be fair, they have over the whole evolutionary period, some ants have gone from being a wasp to an ant, then back to a wasp again. There's so many arguments between scientists because obviously nobody knows. So you look at the evidence and you make an assumption, and then you look for evidence to prove that your assumption is correct. And everyone will look at something different. So no one can say for 100% this is what it is, because we just don't know. We can dig things up, we can make logical conclusions for what we're seeing, but until we look at a real one.
And that is the big problem, is we're always going to have gaps with paleontological studies, because like I mentioned, it depends a lot on the geology. Because obviously for an ant to preserve, you have to think it has to get stuck in the tree sap of a tree in the first place, and then that tree sap has to have long enough to actually harden with the insect inside without being disturbed. And then that bit of amber has to survive for nearly 140 million years without being broken up. And when you think of how a mountain forms with like literally parts of the earth crashing together and ripping each other apart, it's actually incredibly difficult for these things to survive. And obviously we're aware in modern day, like we'll have species of ants that live in mountainous areas, on volcanoes and things like that. But we're never going to know how the prehistoric version of those species looked, because unfortunately those things will never preserve, because lava is probably going to melt and destroy that amber and destroy the insect specimen. There's so many factors that can take away the evidence we require.
For something to be fossilized, it requires instantaneous sediment coverage
Yeah.
to preserve it.
And then essentially it requires like a zero energy environment, which is why the best collection of fossils we have is typically marine fossils, because if they sink into the deep ocean, there's actually very little activity there, so the chance of them being disturbed is very slim. So that's why we get a lot more marine fossils than we do sort of land-based fossils.
Who keeps all the data of the worldwide network? Who keeps it?
So the best way to find data is looking at scientific journals. So there's various different scientific journals available that people publish their work in, and a lot of those are fairly publicly available. Some of them you might need to pay to access the journal, but yeah, there's a variety of different ones. So
The Natural History Museum has got halls upon halls of preserved insects.
yeah,
They're not all on public display, but I believe that if you speak to them, you can get passes for certain things to see certain things. And you can, there's millions of species. There's some things that haven't even been named
yeah.
because they haven't been formally described.
So with museums, private collections, the big thing about them, like the off-show collections, they're not off-show because they don't want anyone to look at them. The stuff that's off-show is just too delicate and requires too much care to be on constant public display. So it's not difficult to go and see them. You just need to talk to the right people and get the right permission to go and see them. But they are quite happy for people to look at them and study them, because they want people to use them to improve our database of knowledge, and because everyone's going to have a potential for an interpretation. And that's a lot of like what we said at the start. It's kind of like a lot of it is just kind of discuss these ideas and ask some questions. Because you might ask a question, and like with this, the question we asked, we found that there is a lot of evidence for those questions already.
Well, we started with the conversation of, is a velvet ant the gap between a wasp and an ant. That's what started this.
And again, when you look at it, it's sort of like not really, because it evolves among the wasps, but it does evolve more towards the kind of ant-like form than a lot of the other wasp species do. So it's quite interesting to look at, but yeah, all of these things are available to anyone to access really. You just have to ask, and as I say, museums are a great place to start with things, because you talk to people and they will suggest good journals to look at and read to start exploring the information further. Go ahead.
So what do you think is probably the biggest breakthrough in like ant science since 2000?
Well,
Go ahead.
it was what, last year they found one of the biggest cow ants that was the same size as a hummingbird.
Yeah.
So, and that's the oldest ant, so that proves that ants existed a hell of a lot longer than we even thought in the first place. I think before, like, they categorised them to like 80 million years ago, and that was like, well actually we were wrong. We're talking about 120 million years ago, not just, it's like it was 40 million years that we didn't know that they existed and we were wrong.
Does that mean wasps that were that size at one point then? Ants were that size?
The thing is, if you increase the oxygen, it allows the insect to get bigger. And the gases that the Earth had then are completely different to now. So now, something that size wouldn't be able to breathe. Back then, it was a lot easier.
But when you consider the size of some modern day hornets still, it's not impossible to imagine, like, because we still get pretty big hornets for nowadays. So yeah, it's very interesting. And the big thing with that is that, like,
And I think because of the size, if you look at them, the smaller the colony, the bigger the workers were. The bigger and the more workers were, they didn't need the size. They can overwhelm things with tiny ants. Like, numbers over.
and the big thing with that is, like saying, like, we found this new specimen. A lot of you could potentially find the next big discovery by just looking where these fossils come out, seeing if you have the permission or can get the permission to go to those locations and just do some collecting yourself. Because you might find something that has never been seen before, and that will really help us improve our scientific knowledge of these animals. It happens all the time, so I know, like, because I like going to the Isle of Wight a lot and looking for dinosaur fossils, and I know there's been lots of new species that have been discovered there by amateurs. It would be people just like yourself that decided to have a holiday there, go down to the beach to look at some dinosaur fossils, and they find a whole new species of dinosaur that helps improve our knowledge and understanding of these past ecosystems.
I just was interested in you, like what your background is. Like, are you scientists or paleontologists or? You just do this as a side
The term I would use
Yeah.
is, I would call us amateur paleontologists,
Okay.
in that we are enthusiastic, but we're technically under the definition of hobbyists at the moment.
I'm paid enough.
But, but obviously, as I say, like, we can still contribute to the scientific knowledge, because we can ask these questions, and we can, as I mentioned, find specimens ourselves by just going out and doing our own private fossil hunts. And that can expand our knowledge incredibly. And technically, any of us can do new research on specimens available. The biggest problem with doing research is always funding. But if you can manage to find funding for it, you can just decide, this is a question that hasn't been answered. I want to be the one to research that. and then you can go ahead and do it.
Science is like more a structure in it, of like you make your hypothesis, you collect data,
Yeah.
you finish it, and you tell other people, here it is, can you read it really? So I guess, yeah, anyone can do it.
Basically, anyone is a scientist if you want to do that research.
Yeah, do it in the scientific method.
It's
Yeah.
technically a job that you can do at any time, and you can do it while doing other work as well. Because you can have a regular job because it's quite hard to actually get a job as like a paleontologist.
Yeah.
But as I say, you could work in Asda, for example, just stacking shelves to earn your money, and then you can use that money to fund research, and that qualifies you as a paleontologist still. I don't know what time that
Yeah, what cookie? I'm guessing was the oldest amber that recently got, is that Australia? Because I'm like, I swear ants came from Antarctica, which I love as well. It's Antarctica, but like,
So these two amber specimens are from Myanmar, which is
Oh,
very
yeah.
well known
Yeah.
for amber collection. And this copal, I believe it says on it,
bottle tickers.
this is from Borneo, the
Oh, yeah.
copal.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is quite old, because this is from the Pleistocene era, which can range from 100,000 years old to 1,000,000 years old. So it's got quite a large range.
Yeah.
And that is the difficulty. It's very difficult to age stuff accurately, because a lot of it depends on
And you don't want to open it
where
either.
we find
no.
it. So it's very difficult to get specific ages, but a lot of it we have to look at the stratigraphy and where it's found in the rock to determine the age. So a lot of ages tend to be a kind of gap, a period, because of that factor. It's very difficult to get the
Like
size.
roughly here.
Yeah. I mean, our plan is, there is a guy in one of the other rooms that has a microscope. So we're hoping that we might go and kind of hang around with him to have people get a closer look at the amber specimens later on in the day. We do have to move on, unfortunately.
The next
If you
lot.
have more questions and you see us around later in the day, feel free to ask us and we'll happily talk to you still.
Hope you all enjoyed it. Sorry, the mark. I haven't missed your chat, have I, Wendy? I haven't missed it, have I? Oh, good. Yeah. Right, back in a sec, please.